If you look at the news, if it bleeds, it leads. And so there's almost all negative news and people get demoralized. I wanted to remind people that there's more whales in the ocean than there has been since 1950. There's more mountain lions in North America than there has been in 200 years. Mountain gorillas and snow leopards and tigers are either holding steady or they're growing by 10% a year. And people need to hear that if they really want to work on an environmental scale. It's not all lost.
Well, hey everyone! Welcome to episode 365 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. This week on the podcast, I'm excited to bring you my interview with one of the most legendary nature photographers of our time, Art Wolfe. Art and I talk about his illustrious career in photography and hopefully provide you, the listener, with inspiration for your own career. We also discuss his new book, Wild Lives, which is a massive tome of inspiration and incredible storytelling. Before we get started, I wanted to thank the latest supporter of the podcast on Patreon, David Lurie. David joined a generous subset of listeners who have signaled to me that they value the podcast. I appreciate all of you so very much. If you too would like to help to keep this project alive and find value in it, please join David by financially supporting the podcast on Patreon by going to patreon.com/F-Stop and Listen, or find a link in today's show notes. Thanks again. You're all the best. Okay, let's get to this week's episode with Art Wolfe. All right, Art Wolfe, it is fantastic to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I have been trying to get you on this show since I started it in 2017, so today is a very exciting moment for me.
Wow, I didn't even know that. Probably I was traveling at the time you wanted to talk.
Yeah, you're a busy guy. Art. I mean, geez, you just told, well, before we started recording, you were telling me about, I think you've been on like 7 continents in the last month or something like that. It's been wild.
Well, certainly over the course of many years, on average year, I do travel to at least 6, if not 7 continents during the course of 1 year. As I've aged, that has slowed a little bit, but not to any significant degree.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely dive into how you keep that going, because that is inspiring and also fascinating, I think, for most of our listeners to hear you talk about that. But before we do that, maybe just real quick for the 7 people on planet Earth who have never heard of you, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, Art.
Sure. I actually live in an old house in West Seattle, 1 mile from where I was born in 1951. And for the better part of the last 5 decades, I've been traveling internationally, photographing a multitude of subjects, though I'm very well known, I believe, within certain circles for wildlife. In fact, I've done many books on cultures and humans, abstraction. I'm working on a book currently called Act of Faith that looks at all the world's large, obvious religions, but also voodoo and shamanism. So I really love to surprise my audience, because the minute they pigeonhole you into one genre, I want to throw a monkey wrench into that and come up with a book like Human Canvas, which are all naked humans that I've hand painted into elaborate backdrops, and that really surprised a lot of people. So I take joy in, doing things that is unexpected.
I love it. And you strike me as the kind of person that has about 750,000 ideas running through your head at all times. How do you figure out which one you actually want to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely type A, Virgo, left-handed. I make plans way in advance. I make lists of everything I'm going to do the next day, let alone the next week, let alone the next year. I'm very planned out. In fact, to the detriment, because when I was younger, as like you, I got into photography through climbing, and I can remember with fondness calling up friends and going into the Cascades or the Olympic Mountains. And now you need permits in advance, and those days of freedom and spontaneity are over. I have to be really organized. I've got a staff of 5 people that I work with and a long-term travel partner, Gabrielle Jacan, who's worked with me for the last 30 years. So yeah, I'm really organized when it comes to that. And if I falter on that, my staff will remind me this and that. And I've got 2 ladies that work in my office, each one for now 31 years. And so it's like an extended family.
Wow, that's tremendous. That also makes me incredibly jealous because I'm one of those, one-man shows. Like, I just have to do everything myself. Emails, marketing, everything is on me. But I kind of like it because it makes you, it keeps you on your toes and also forces you to learn as all kinds of different disciplines. So it's nice
I have to laugh at that because I remember other photographers in the Seattle area would say, yeah, sure, you can do that because you've got a staff. And I say, well, I've never taken a vacation. I work 7 days a week to afford the staff. I came from a fairly lower income family post-war. That would be Second World War. And so I learned how to work hard for what I've got, and to employ the people that I do means that I work all the time. So I find people that complain or are envious, but they take vacations, or they work 5 days a week rather than 7. I'm not trying to sing the sorrow song because I like working. And I think the photography, probably exactly like you, Matt, photography is a passion. Never felt like I need a vacation. And people will say, oh yeah, but your life is a vacation. And I'll say, yeah, try traveling internationally where you've got lines and inspections and customs and all the nonsense that it takes to get to the location you want to be.
Yeah, I just came through Buenos Aires about a month ago, and it took me like 4 hours just to get from my plane to my next plane. I mean, it was just insanity. So I totally appreciate that.
Well, the airport in Buenos Aires can be that way.
Yeah, I think every time Buenos Aires it likes to trick me that way. But I like what you said there because, my wife likes to say that too. She's like, oh, you're going on vacation all the time. I'm like, no, it's work. Yes, I'm having a great time, but that doesn't mean it's not work. And so the secret to, I think, long-term success in photography is that you have to love it and you have to put everything you've got into it, which means you're working 7 days a week, 365 days a year, probably, but it doesn't feel like work if you really love it, I think.
Yeah, in fact, like you, I do a lot of teaching and guiding tours in between the books that I work on. And my clientele are a little older. They're successful in businesses, and now they've turned to photography. And I usually start off a class by saying, congratulations, you've found your place. And what I meant by that is passion. People that have a passion, whether it's cooking or writing or dance or any of those disciplines, it's a reason to get out of bed and keep moving forward. I think the people that lack that are the ones that go away early in life. And so I want to work until I can no longer work. My father lived to 94. I'm hoping to at least live that long and stay relevant. And that's all of our wishes, I'm sure. But passion is the key, and that's what I hammer home to the participants in many of my workshops in North America. Then when we travel to Kenya, like last week I got back from Kenya, everybody was really thrilled with what they were seeing and photographing, and I don't have to really remind them at that point. They get it already.
Speaking of people developing their passion for photography, how did the spark catch you? What led you to pick up the camera for the first time?
It's very easy. I was a painting and art major at the University of Washington, fine art painting, but also a second degree in art history and education. And at that time, my parents gave me an old Konica camera, and I can remember there was no instructions. It was a used camera, By the way, my parents were also wedding photographers using 4x5s to shoot weddings. And prior to that, my father was working off an aircraft carrier in the South Pacific during World War II. So there were cameras around the house, but I never really got into wanting to photograph people at that point. I started hanging out with climbers and started climbing in the Cascades, eventually leading climbs up Mount Rainier and other volcanoes, then into the North Cascades. And then I also became a program chairman for a climbing club within the Boeing company. And I started booking people like Jim Whittaker, the first American to climb Mount Everest, and other well-known climbers. And eventually I got invited as expedition photographer to the first Western expedition allowed into China, into Tibet, up the northeast ridge of Mount Everest. And by that time I was really hooked on photographing rather than painting. And simply put, it was far easier to create original compositions through the photographic medium rather than sitting in front of a blank canvas trying to conjure up a meaningful painting. And so I never looked back, although right next to me is an easel and I've got brushes, and that is waiting for me to when I'm too old and cadre to travel as much as I am right now. And so that's waiting in the wings.
I love that you got into it through climbing is the same as I did. There's a lot of photographers that kind of have that entry point. I know, Galen Rowell is a good example of that, and there's lots of other examples of people who found their love for photography through the mountains. So it's awesome to hear that you're one of us.
Yeah, and prior to that, even when I was 7 years old, I had a little tree book, mammal book, bird book, and I self-taught myself every fern, every mushroom, every bird in the forest. And so that was part of my background. So I was like the school artist in grade school, junior high, and high school. And so art and natural history were ingrained in me from a very early age. And in fact, I've never really diverted from those passions and those interests. And I find what's really interesting, and I'm sure you probably know this, Matt, is in the age of Instagram, people, it's almost like a flash mob. If somebody sees an owl posted on Instagram, there's droves of people that will suddenly appear in the field north of Seattle looking for the long-eared owl, but they don't even know what kind of owl. They just have all the equipment I do, but they don't know what they're photographing. And knowing and understanding behavior of the subjects really is part and parcel to getting the shots that are meaningful to people that ultimately look at the photos. The behavior and anticipation, what the animal's going to do, all of those really add up to the ultimate image that might find its way into a book or Instagram. Though I've only looked at my Instagram page once. I have people that do Instagram and Facebook. I really don't look at that, and I don't look at other people's work out of intention. I want to be like a horse that's got blinders on the side of their head and just stay focused on what I want to do. Otherwise, I think you can get lost in all the photos that are out there, and it can be demoralizing for a lot of people to realize how many people are getting great shots. So I really like to focus just on what I'm doing. I'm very well aware of my colleagues' work, but I don't spend a lot of time on the internet for that.
Yeah. Well, I totally agree with what you said about having a better understanding of the subjects that you photograph, and obviously that applies to landscapes as well, but especially important in wildlife. I mean, a good example is I just got done with a 2-week trip to Yellowstone, and several times we came across coyotes that were hunting mice and voles in the snow, and as you just observe them and watch them, you started to realize that, okay, when they start moving their head back and forth, that means that they're listening for the mouse under the snow, and that's when they're about to get ready to jump. And so just having that understanding gives you a better chance of anticipating the photograph that you want to capture. So it's a perfect example of what you're talking about. Yeah.
That's a good illustration of anticipation and knowledge and getting the shot. Because coyote or that fox is in the air only for a split second. And if you're not prepared, all you're getting is the tail end of the animal going into the snow.
Oh, trust me, I got a lot of that.
We all do. That's where
Yeah.
we learn.
Exactly. All right. All right. Well, so you've authored over 80 books now, I believe, over the course of your career.
You know, it's
Um,
funny because I don't notch the bedpost. I don't know how many books I've done. My staff would say well over 100, but they're including children's books and foreign imprints and all that. So if it's 80 books, that's still almost embarrassing. Well, it's embarrassing to me, but it also belies the fact that I love books. My library is filled with my colleagues' books and other books on art. And often I would sit in the den and look at books. And I find my inspiration often through the work of other people, though I don't want to copy their work. I want to use them as a source of inspiration and then take it on to my own, aesthetic. And I know a lot of people use that, use some of my books for the same reason. And I think that's great. I've heard of people that will take a book of mine and literally cut out pages and travel with the photos and tell their fixer or their guide, this is what I want. And I think that is a step too far. But I think finding inspiration, we all do that. We all learn from the work of others. I also dive into art books for inspiration, but putting a photographic slant onto somebody else's work that may have painted in the 1800s or earlier.
yeah, there's definitely a fine line between inspiration and emulation, and that's something that I've talked about a lot on this show before, and it's something that particularly frustrates me on occasion when I see a lot of well-known photographers who have a very large following going to very, how do I say this? They kind of go out of their way to find these very niche locations that only a couple of people know about so that they can have that shot for their Instagram or whatever. And
Yeah.
it's super frustrating when people do that, especially when they don't provide credit to the person that inspired them to go get that photo to begin with. And so I'm curious for you, thinking back along your long career, has that approach always been the case for you, or have you kind of...
Yeah, it was really ingrained in me. One of my instructors at the University of Washington in the fine art program was Jacob Lawrence, and arguably one of the most famous African American painters. His paintings are hung in the White House, the rotunda of the Capitol, and the Smithsonian. But he always kind of chided me on to not be too satisfied with the work I was doing, to always push myself, always put that carrot slightly beyond your reach. And that was ingrained. I mean, that really made a difference. And I can remember other people of my age that kind of left the program because they didn't want to be chastised or goaded into different directions. But I always took it as salient advice and moving forward. And so, yeah, I look at almost every photo I've ever taken and realize I could do better, and there's a fine line between being too easily satisfied and complacent and always being frustrated. That's a fine line you walk. And I think if you just always put the carrot slightly beyond your reach, it keeps you moving forward without, frustration. And I kind of get tired of hearing people always moaning about their work. And I say, you've got to acknowledge what you've done well here, but also realize that there are other avenues. And I love going back to locations or subjects because I'm getting better as a photographer every year. And it's about the mind and the intellect, and we just get better with age, I think. And it has served me well over the years. Several of the books that were done early in my career, and I almost cringe at looking at it. And it also speaks volumes for the fact that when I first started out, our ISOs, our films were very slow. If you're a wildlife photographer, the animal had to be dead before you could get it in focus. And today we have such great technology and high ISOs that you're able to get photographs that would only have been a dream 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say is, the equipment's gotten so much better, And not only that, but the processing tools that we have available to us today are so much better as well. I mean, it's really almost easy now.
Well, it's exactly that. And so, can you imagine if I was going to go to Sumatra and photograph orangutans? We would use faxes. We would fax back and forth, and it was laboriously long. And you were trying to find somebody that spoke English that could guide you. And now if you Google orangutan Sumatra, you've got 50 different fixers or guides that could take you there in a heartbeat, or there's books on it. So it's a very different landscape. And yet, younger photographers that kind of came into the world of photography after digital and in the more recent years, they complain about this glitch or that glitch, and I'm still thrilled that we can get these photos anyways. I think it was good training to learn to research, to search subjects, and go through the process. And I've been doing that, and my staff have been doing that for a number of years. And we're amazed now at how many photographers have really good photos. And I think that that's a good thing for me too, because that means to stay relevant, I've got to sharpen up and stay on the road. Otherwise, people forget that you're even alive.
Yeah, well, speaking of staying sharp, I mean, we just talked about the fact that you have 80, 100, 300,000 books. We don't even know. A lot of books. And now you've just released another new book called Wild Lives. Tell us a little bit about the book, the impetus behind the project, and what do you hope that the book accomplishes?
Okay. It's pretty easy for me to describe the book. As a selfish photographer, I want to go out and see with my own eyes snow leopards or blue whales or. And so that was part of the drive. I hadn't really done a book on international wildlife for a very long time, and so that was a second part. But if you look at the news, if it bleeds, it leads. And so there's almost all negative news, and people get demoralized. I know personally 2 young men that have actually gone schizophrenic, and because of COVID and the climate change and the economy and the politics, it is kind of a bleak world out there. And yet I wanted to remind people that there's more whales in the ocean than there has been since 1950. There's more mountain lions in North America than there has been in 200 years. Mountain gorillas and snow leopards and tigers are either holding steady or they're growing by 10% a year. And people need to hear that if they really want to work on an environmental scale. It's not all lost. And so I wanted that book, Wild Lives, to be kind of something that cheered people up, but gave them an honest view on world wildlife during the Anthropocene or the Anthropocene, the age of man. And so there's a lot of good things out there, but it wouldn't necessarily lead the news. And so that's part of why I did the book. I invited Gregory Green, who I've known for 40 years as a biologist, and I invited him to write the text, and I kept on thinking, all right, it's going to be kind of cut and dried, nuts and bolts, and yet he rose to the challenge and wrote some of the most eloquent writing I've ever read. So I'm really pleased that he was part of the book. And I love, I have long-term friends and long-term relationships. And so it was great to invite a long-term friend of mine to be part of that book. And then I dedicated the book to Gabrielle Jacon, who has worked side by side with me years. And so the book is dedicated to Gab.
What is the time span of the work that's encompassed inside of the book?
It's a great question. There are some photos that go back. Well, I mean, there's the first photo I ever took is in the front of the book. And it's really a blurry shot of a cow moose up in Canada, but I shot that with a Brownie Fiesta. But that was the photo that hooked me on wildlife photography too. Some of the photos go back 30 years, but very few. And in fact, I don't want this book to be kind of a look back at my favorite photos. simply because I recognize the fact that some people keep on rechanneling the same old photos into new books. I'd rather have a book that's fresh and new with a few of my favorite shots in the book. And that's what we really did. And so most of the photos were taken in the last 5 to 7 or 8 years.
So along those same lines, I'm curious, at what point did you come up with the idea for this book?
Oh,
Like, how long ago was that?
I would say it was percolating in the back of my mind for 10 years. And then I approached my publisher, who's done several of my books, probably about 7 years ago. And that's what it takes. I mean, look at in the modern world, unless you were born rich, any modern photographer that their genre is really connected to culture or wildlife or landscapes really do have to lead tours. And I love teaching. I was trained as a teacher. And so I love sharing whatever I've learned. I like to pass that on. But what I'm trying to say is you've got to balance actually shooting photos of wildlife for a book with actually making money leading tours or workshops. So I love doing both. And yet it does take at least 7 or 10 years to really do a book that isn't just a really nice cover photo, but throughout the book it's got to maintain the same level of quality.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge to create a book, especially one that encompasses such a broad subject. I mean, you have animals in your book from every continent, I feel like, and including both poles. And so, that obviously for the mere mortals of us, that would probably take 20 or 30 years of travel to be able to pull that off. So I feel like you've definitely tackled a monumental task here to pull together all the images for this book.
Yeah, and I got recertified for scuba diving. Prior to this book, the last photos I was taking underwater was for a book called Vanishing Act, and it was filmed down in Indonesia. And so I got a brand new underwater housing and got recertified during COVID down in Mexico. And so I went to the Coral Triangle and shot coral reefs with tropical fish and all of that. A lot of snorkeling with humpbacks underwater. I just love actually getting out there and seeing this with my own eyes. The last photos actually that I shot that were included in the book were snow leopards. And I had been there 10 years before up in Ladakh, India. And yeah, I saw a mother with 2 cubs, but they were so far away. It was ridiculous. And on this last trip for the book was in April of last year, I was able to see 6 different cats, but still I had a 1200 millimeter and I couldn't see the cats with my naked eye unless I put the 1200 on, and then I could see them and photograph them. And even at that, it was 1/3 of a frame that was used in the book. So, they still remain elusive and hard to see.
Yeah. Well, speaking about the kind of twist of your book being a way of kind of generating positivity about what there is to actually look forward to in terms of what's happening in nature and causes for conservation, and that actually some conservation efforts are making a difference in building back wildlife populations. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about what the role of conservation has played in determining the projects that you've undertaken throughout your career.
Well, I have to say, Matt, you have great questions. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
A lot of the books I've worked on, we attach to organizations. I did a book called Tribes, and we had David Mayberry Lewis, who founded Cultural Survival, write the text for that. The NRDC did a book with us on Edge of the Earth, Corner of the Sky, which was a world landscape book. The Living Wild, I had Jane Goodall and George Schaller. We had the founder of the Nature Conservancy. We had the founder of the Wildlife Conservation Society. And out of Oxford University, we had Richard Dawkins all write original text. So I love marrying the book with people that have important things to say. But it also makes sense then if the NRDC, which is the Natural Resource Defense Council, they have a huge membership. And so they would frequently buy a lot of books and distribute it through their own channels. So marrying my projects with an organization that has fairly large membership is not a bad idea going forward. And so this book, Wild Lives, really doesn't have that connection. It's really about getting it out there, and later on in June I'll be traveling to New York and to Boston, Denver, and giving presentations on the book, just to keep the book in front of the press and in front of people. And we'll have local bookstores, like in Denver, the Tattered Cover, I believe. They will bring in books and they'll make the sale. I don't really care about that. We also sell books right out of my own office and inscribed. But it is part and parcel to the process of, if you're going to do a book with a publisher, you got to get behind the book and promote it and sell it and keep talking about it, even though I'm still in the last stages of that book called Act of Faith that looks at the world religions and voodoo and all of that. And so it's like, okay, planning out a whole year. I know virtually every day for this year where I'm going to be and what I'm doing.
Yeah, talk about next level. I know, my transition into full-time photography is fairly recent. And before that, photography occupied probably, 30-40% of my time. And now it's 1,000% of my time. And I wouldn't have it any other way. But I haven't quite reached that level yet where every single day of my year is planned out. But I would say, I have enough things going on and projects I'm working on and my schedule for teaching that it's probably about 200 days a year that I've got penciled out. So I think...
Well, try to keep it at 200. I mean, I'm not saying or boasting that every day of the year is planned out, because, there could be an amazing eruption in Iceland. And by the way, I'm doing a book down the road called Fire and Ice. And so I've been on a lot of volcanoes as of late. But all that kind of freedom to spontaneous's react is gone. I'm going to be in Denver or whatever, LA, when it dries out. And it's not an envious thing because I kind of miss those days of spontaneity. And yet right now I'm in the month of February, and my next trip, I've canceled a couple short workshops just because I was following polar bears recently in early November with heavy boots, and I started straining the muscles in the psoas muscles in my body, and I'm not 40, I'm 72. And for 4 days, I'm following these polar bears on uneven tundra, and I overdid it. And so now this month, I'm seeing a rolfer, I'm catching up on yard work, and I'm going out to dinner with friends. This is the closest thing in years that I've had some time off. But then March comes, and Gav comes in from Thailand, and we're off and running again.
Yeah, but I'm guessing you wouldn't give it up.
Oh, no. I mean, every part of my life I'm actually satisfied. I don't have a wife or a husband or a dog or a cat, but what I've got is what I remember and what I cherish. So I never lament what I don't have. I only celebrate what I've got. And nobody's got a perfect life. And so I've had a great life. I've seen every animal that I ever really wanted to see. I've been in the landscapes that I've always wanted to see. I know more about the world than any living president or past president. It's been a great life. And again, I'll reflect back that I came from an impoverished family, and the camera that they gave me ultimately became then a passport to the world. And so I never don't appreciate my parents or my lifestyle.
Well, I had a question I was going to say for the very end, but I feel like it's the perfect time to ask it now. What legacy do you hope your work leaves?
The legacy is passing on whatever I've learned, I teach. Whatever I learned today, I teach tomorrow. I don't covet or cloister information. I want to share it. And so the people that have taken workshops and tours that are really become very good photographers, I feel proud about that. The books certainly are a legacy that I will leave behind. And that's pretty good. And a lot of friends. I don't know if I'll leave them behind or outlive them, but certainly the friends and the acquaintances I've met is part of the legacy. And so I'm pretty satisfied, dude. I've never said dude in my life, but it seemed appropriate.
I'm curious, do you think that photographers should think more about legacy in kind of how they wrap their heads around what they're spending their efforts on?
Well, you brought him up earlier, not Franz Landing, but Galen Rowell. And Franz and I were talking about Galen and the fact that he died unexpectedly in a plane crash. And now there's no legacy. You know, whoever took over his archive, you will never see those photos. And so his legacy are the books that remain in our libraries, but nobody's marketing his work like Ansel Adams. And Franz and I were both talking. We're the same age. We've been teaching workshops together in the past 5 or 7 years. And we're all looking what happens with our archive. And we're not going to live forever. We do recognize that. And so I think part of my legacy is trying to figure out what to do with the archive. Now, I've got younger people. Everybody on my staff are younger than me. My hope would be to create a foundation upon my death that still employs the people that have given most of their life to me and provide for that. My biggest worry is all the pine trees. I've got an amazing garden of Japanese pines and red pines that I've spent 40 years bonsaiing, and they are the most expensive things that I own. They're worth $30,000 to $60,000, and when I pass, if you don't know how to prune those trees, they'll just grow into big, ugly trees. So I worry about that, and what will happen. And when I'm gone, maybe I shouldn't be worrying about those kind of things. I ramble on. You asked me about legacy, and now we're talking about pine trees.
No, it's interesting because I feel like it's something that as we age, we start to think about a little bit more in terms of what do we want to leave behind for the world? Yeah. What kind of impact do we want to have? And I know for myself, it's a question it's coming up a little bit more often in terms of how do I make my photography have more of a lasting impact, and that helps sometimes, I think, determines what you photograph too. So yeah,
Matt, I think it's a human need to leave something, to have something left behind that people do recognize that you lived at one time. And I think it's why people graffiti walls and carve their names into aspen trees, which you have aspen trees in your neighborhood. And if you go up, like in Utah, there's Boulder Pass out of the Escalante, and there are so many trees that are carved with people's names, and sometimes the dates are 1865, and people want to leave something behind. I think people that get married and have children and grandchildren, it goes on and on. But if you're people like me that have no offspring, it's the books and it's the knowledge that I've shared with people over the years.
And parenthetically speaking, do not carve trees, please.
You know what's funny about that, though? What a graffiti on a rock, I've studied a lot of rock art, petroglyphs, and petroglyphs are carvings in the rock, and pictographs are paintings on the rock. And I've been to sites in Northern Australia where they speculate are either 40 to 70,000 years old. But at the time, if they were painted today, that would be graffiti and marring the landscape. And with time, then, it becomes something that's precious. And those trees up on Boulder Pass that have carvings that are into the tree that are over 100 years old suddenly take on a different perspective. So I agree with you. I don't want to see people spray painting rocks and carving up trees and all that. And yet, with time, what is an eyesore could, in fact, be a historical record. So I find it an interesting slant on things.
Yeah, no, I've actually thought about that too, and I think it is a valid perspective. Here in
Carving on
Colorado,
trees is
oh, it's like the worst for me. I hate it when I see people carving in aspen trees because it's like, ugh.
and aspen trees are really the trees that people select to carve. I just taught a workshop down in Bishop, California, and there is a roadside picnic area, and we were photographing along a creek there. Every tree is covered in graffiti or carvings. And then the tree heals over, and you could hardly make out what somebody did. But because I teach photography as art and abstraction and American abstraction, there are shots in that group that look like a American abstract painting. So yeah, I'm both repulsed but attracted to human interaction. But I totally agree with you. Out of place, they look awful. And yeah, white trees are beautiful in and of themselves.
Exactly. Well, we had earlier brought up the name of Galen Rowell, and I have a pretty long lead-in for this question, so be patient with me. In May of 1998, The Atlantic magazine published what I personally consider one of the best articles of our time relating to what has since become a rather commonplace occurrence. The article is called Photography in the Age of Falsification, and it's something I reference relatively often in arguments with my peers. In the article, you're more or less pitted against the late Galen Rowell, with each of you kind of taking up a position on one side of the argument relating to the use of Photoshop to add or remove objects from our photographs. And as I understand it, it was quite the controversy at the time, and nowadays people would just laugh at it. But you had cloned in some birds into a photograph that appeared in your book, Migrations. And so my question is, with the advent of artificial intelligence and with over 20 years of experience under your belt since that article was published, how has your position or thinking relating to that particular subject shifted, if at all?
It hasn't shifted at all. In fact, the biggest argument wasn't with Galen, it was with Tom Mangelson, who's a dear friend of mine. He was arguing, and I said, did you actually read the introduction on that book? Because it wasn't false. We were paying homage to M.C. Escher, this Dutch artist, and it was at a time where digital wasn't something we had in our cameras, but you could scan an image into a digital format and change the content. And so in the introduction, we called the work that we were doing digital illustrations. Nobody really read that. They just talked about the book. They didn't even own the book. My opinion hasn't changed. We live at a time where you can take skies and then drop them in. And other than that book, it's not something I'm interested in. And I think in the age of AI, and you can conjure up amazing creations, there will be greater value on a book like Wild Lives, which have none of that, and all are wild, truly wild animals. So I think the value will increase for something that isn't altered whatsoever. And it's a slippery slope, because some photographers would never remove a cigarette butt in the foreground of a landscape, and I will, without hesitation, try to pick them up and remove them. I will remove something like that. But other people will remove entire buildings and change the content, and everybody's got their own opinion. I'm repulsed, honestly, when I see people just photographing skies and I say, I got the perfect landscape to drop that in. I'm where people were back in the 80s about the book Migrations. But the people that condemned that book never interviewed me and would make, like, there's a shot of one zebra in a sea of wildebeest, and I know there were writers that would say obvious dropping in a zebra, and the ones that they thought were illustrations were actually straight photos. And in fact, there were only 30 out of 100 photos that had minor changes, And the cover of the book was the most radical, where there were probably 1,000 zebras that had backed up on the Mara River before they were going to cross. And so there was grass on both ends of that photo, and we removed the grass and put in animals from beyond and in front. There was never cloning a single animal to make a herd, which is what a lot of people that were condemning the book would say. So I learned a lot about hypocrisy and yellow journalism during that whole process. I was the lightning rod on a world scale about falsification, and yet we didn't, our staff, same staff that I have today, talked at length about it. It wasn't something that we took lightly, and we thought, all right, this is a book of nature based on the work of an artist. And to that degree, we felt it was appropriate if people read the introduction.
Well, and to your point,
and Galen, soon as that argument kind of got tired, he embraced digital technology and used it a little, in my thoughts, a little clumsy at first. But, Galen was really a great guy and great for photography, quite honestly. He inspired me. He wrote the introduction to my second book and was very complimentary. And so I think Galen loved a good debate, and it's tragic that he's gone.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, I think context matters. I think how we talk about those types of images is important. And in your example, you did it for a very specific artistic purpose to kind of showcase how these animals are similar to M.C. Escher paintings. And to me, that's intent. Oftentimes nowadays, we don't see that type of stuff done with similar intent. It's usually just, oh, it looks better this way, so I'm going to do it,
Yeah, so. I think that a lot of people wanted total identification and illustration about what was done and where, and I get that. That was a valid criticism, but we wanted this to be an art book, and blending nature and art was a difficult task to do at the time we're talking about. The same book that was condemned by purists was also given awards for design. And so the world of art and nature was really split during that time. And today, unfortunately, people don't even care. And I think that's a bad thing. I think people should care, and they should know whether it's a straight photo or an AI or a captive or whatever. Remember that I was active as a photographer in the late 70s, and the things that we would do, I remember doing a book on owls where I would work with a biologist down in Oregon to get a shot of a spotted owl, and the biologist would take a mouse and kind of tie it down on the stump for the owl to come in, and then he would catch the owl and band it and all that, and I was tagging along. But today that would be condemned, and at the same time AI is expanding into photography. There's also a movement amongst younger nature photographers. Nothing can be altered, or not. You can't even whistle or attract the attention of an animal. They are very pure in what they believe. So I think it's a good thing that they are that dogmatic about that. At the same time, the whole world of AI is a scary thought to us older guys.
Yeah, no, it's scary, but also fascinating. I have lots of opinions on it that I've shared before, so we don't have to dive into it. But relating to that topic, I'm curious how your vision for your photographic work has shifted since you started your career.
I think it gets more abstract as I've aged and more sophisticated. And if that's not true, then what the hell have I been doing for the last 5 decades? So, yeah, I look back at a book. I think the book that Galen wrote the introduction was called The Kingdom. And I look at that book, and at the time, it was kind of a landmark book because the photos looked nice, and I tried to influence it with the knowledge of art and history and all that. But when I look at the book now and the book Wildlives, I mean, they're night and day. The quality of the work, the quality of the composition, the technology that we're using, all of that is part and parcel why I believe Wild Lives is one of the strongest books I've ever worked on, and I'm very proud of that book.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So relating to that, I mean, when I think about the field of photographers that exist today, your name is right at the top of the list in terms of someone who has found success in your career. What are the necessary ingredients for an upcoming photographer looking to find similar success in their own career?
Well, I think taking some natural history classes and drawing classes and art classes would give them a leg up on a lot of their colleagues. And it's not that you have to view photography as a competition, but to be blatantly honest, if you want to be relevant and make a living, you've got to be somewhat different. And so I think having a sense of composition and aesthetics is critical. History and knowing what you're shooting is really helpful. And then you have to not look at it as a 5-day-a-week job. It's life. It will consume your life if you want to be successful. And not in a bad way, in a good way. I mean, I'm not complaining one iota about the amount of effort that I've put into and my belt size is 31 now, and I've always maintained 32 throughout my life. So I'm losing a little weight, I'm eating less, but I like the fact that I'm not walking around with 30 or 40 extra pounds and laying around watching TV.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting that you brought up physical health because especially wildlife and nature landscape, ideally we're going to have the ability to hike long distances, to photograph the types of subjects that we find interesting. And I think one of the things I see a lot of people overlooking is the need to stay physically fit and to stay physically active and continue to condition and strength train and work on your endurance and hiking and things like that. So I'm glad you brought that up because it's not something that people talk about very often.
Yeah, you want to have a full life. And so it doesn't escape my attention that 5 other individuals are reliant on my health. And so one of the women that has worked with me, Chris Eckhoff, for the last 31, now 32 years, she is almost a wife. Though she is married, she is almost like a wife because she manages all the appointments and, I'm not going to die from lack of effort. I'm not going to die because suddenly there's a cancer that is invading my body that I'm not aware of, because I do go to regular checkups and maintain my health. And I do that not just for myself, but for the health of the business. And so I think it's a lot of people just ignore doctors or whatever. And I'm not one of those. And I'm not a hypochondriac. And in fact, the biggest debate right now is, should a 72-year-old man get up on a cedar shake roof with a blower and blow the leaves off the top? And this is the first year where I'm using ropes and carabiners to anchor myself. But before that, they were all holding their breath. So I got to be a little wiser in my choices.
That's
yeah,
funny.
I'm one of those guys. But I'm not ignoring my health. So yeah, after this interview, I'm having blood work downtown just to make sure everything's good.
That's awesome. All right, well, I only have a couple of other questions for you, Art. One thing that I feel like a lot of other photographers might not know about you is that you hosted a TV series called Travels to the Edge, which I believe aired for 2 seasons and is still available on Amazon and Vimeo. What sparked that project and what was it about?
I had an earlier show called Safari, and it was on ESPN Sports. And you have to realize that when I was in high school, I was a saboteur. I was sitting in the back of the class making wisecracks, embarrassing whoever's trying to give a speech. But when it was time for me to get up and give a speech, I go white. I would just freeze like a deer in the headlights. And so getting a teaching certificate gave me the hope that I could actually carry on in front of people. And it broke that fear, which a lot of people have. It's like a cornered coyote either dies or fights back. And I realized that if I raised my voice and had some sort of assurance in what I'm saying, I could actually meet with editors or give talks before a large crowd, which I can do now. It's just an extension of sharing what I love. And I ultimately became fairly successful at giving public speeches. At one point, the Discovery Channel was just a brand new channel, and they were looking for content. And the year before, I had gone with a film crew up to Alaska, and we did a program called On Location with Art Wolfe, of a producer in Las Vegas who wanted to do safari, which was, in short, taking celebrities like John Denver up to Alaska or Robert Duvall to Africa. I mean, we did celebrities that were interested in photography, and that was successful. And then Travels to the Edge was an idea that I had going around the world and taking a audience with me with a film crew. That lasted 2 years, as you pointed out, but what I'm really pleased with was the fact that it was aired in 70 countries around the world. And that just extended the audience for books and everything else. It took me off my game in terms of working on private projects, because that show and doing a TV series is a lot of work. And so in 2008, there was a world crash in the economy. And so funding for that ended, and I immediately pivoted to working on a project called The Human Canvas, where we took the human form and all different races and genders, and we'd spray paint people white or black, and I'd hand paint them into very elaborate backgrounds, and it was all studio work, and it wasn't sexually charged, but it was more theatrical, and I used tribal designs or inspiration for that. And so I love drawing on experiences and earlier works to find my way forward. And I often have doubled back on projects that I've done before and kind of taken them off on their own new evolutionary journey. And so the TV show was that, and then came The Human Canvas, and then.
Well, Art, you are a huge inspiration to me and so many others.
Thank you, Matt.
My last question: who are a couple of people that inspire you over the years? Who are some people that you've looked up to, or that have given you energy to expand your horizons as a photographer and artist?
Definitely some of the people I've mentioned already. Galen, Franz, Tom Mengelson, Jim Brandenburg were all inspirational. But then there's a lot of photographers that work in other genres, like Karsten, Salgado, and people like that. I've got all their books. And then I also find a lot of inspiration through American abstract expressionism, and before that, the French Impressionists, done books that are based on Monet and other famous Impressionists. So I just am like a sponge. I have these books, I look at it, and I think, okay, there's an idea, and I'll run with it. And there's a painter, Nero, I think is his name, that had a famous painting of a naked woman, and in the background, in the complexity of the forest, were lions hiding. And I thought, that's a concept. And so Vanishing Act became part of that. And so I'm like a sponge, and then I spin it into my own, personal journey.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, Art, thank you for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to join me for this chat today. Just real quick, how can people learn more about your latest book? Where should they go to get a copy?
Well, they can come into the website, and my website's Art Wolfe. By the way, people often ask, is that your real name? And I respond, no, my real name's Melvin Pickles. And they go, come on. So, yeah, I was born Arthur Richard Wolfe, and it was friends of mine in high school that abridged Arthur to Art. But any rate, that's how they can find it. Art Wolfe. We have books, we sell books, we inscribe it. People can, type in what they want the inscription to be, and then they get the book. It's a little more expensive than Amazon, but you get the signed inscription, and I think that's worth a lot. And so thank you for that. Or go to Amazon, or go to your bookstore in your city. Some of the smaller bookstores have been put out of business, obviously, by Amazon. But if they have a robust bookstore, like Powell Books down in Portland, or Powell's Books is excellent. Tattered Cover in Denver, I still think is viable. In Seattle, we have, oh my God, we have a huge book, Elliott Bay Books, and it's like Powell's. I mean, it's just vast and sprawling and has all these different books, and I love books, so I love these bookstores.
Brilliant. Well, thanks again, Art. I really appreciate you and your staff's giving us the time and attention, and best of luck on the next project.
Thank you. It's great talking to you, and good luck with your career.
All right. Well, thank you to Art for the fantastic conversation and providing us with so much inspiration. If you've not picked up a copy of Art's book yet, I highly encourage you to. It is really quite incredible. I am honestly blown away that Art has been able to remain this productive as a photographer for so long. If I'm even half as productive across my career, I'll consider it a smashing success. Speaking of success, I'd love to hear your stories of success. How do you define success in photography? I find the answer to this question lies at the core of what we do. Please do reach out and share your stories with me. Be sure to engage with us in these conversations over on Patreon, where you can join in on the discussions about each episode, whether you're a paying member or not. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much. That's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.